What's the moment a real estate deal actually starts to fall apart? A lot of people would say price. They'd say the number got too high, or the appraisal came in low, or the seller wanted one thing and the buyer wanted another. But from what I've seen, that's usually not the first crack. The first crack is earlier than that. It happens when somebody walks into the negotiation unprepared, or emotional, or so focused on winning one point, they forget they're trying to hold the whole deal together. And in real estate, that can happen fast. A buyer falls in love with a house and offers too aggressively without knowing the comps. A seller gets offended by a clean, justified offer because nobody framed it the right way. An inspection turns up issues, and instead of negotiating the items that actually matter, everybody starts fighting over loose doorknobs and chipped paint. A texting thread gets longer, the tone gets colder, and suddenly a deal that was completely workable starts feeling personal. That's the thing about negotiation in real estate. It is never just about price. It's about preparation. It's about timing. It's about emotional control. It's about knowing the market well enough to make a strong first move and knowing people well enough to understand what's really driving the other side. Because a compelling initial offer sets the tone. A sloppy one does too. And that matters whether you're representing a first-time buyer, a seasoned investor, or a seller who swears they're not in a hurry but is already mentally moved to another state. So today, I want to talk about what actually makes negotiations work. Not in theory, not like a training manual, more like the way it shows up in real conversations with real buyers, real sellers, real agents, and those moments where a deal could go one of two ways depending on one decision or one sentence. Here's what I've noticed after years around this business. Deals don't usually die because one side was a few $1,000s apart. They die because somebody misread the market, or misread the motivation, or let emotion take the wheel. And the agents who consistently protect deals, they're not always the loudest. They're not always the most aggressive. Usually, they're the best prepared. They know the market inside and out. They know the comparable sales. They know what the house is worth, what their client wants, where the flexibility is, and where it absolutely is not. That kind of preparation changes everything. Because once you know the market, you stop guessing. You stop negotiating from anxiety. You stop confusing hope with leverage. I've seen agents lose deals before they even wrote the offer. Not because they were bad people, not because they weren't trying, because they went in without a real read on current market conditions. They didn't know whether they were in a buyer's market where concessions were realistic or a seller's market where asking for too much upfront would make their offer easy to dismiss. They hadn't reviewed the comparable sales closely enough to justify the number. They couldn't explain why their offer made sense. And when you can't explain it, you usually can't defend it. That's where a comparative market analysis becomes more than paperwork. It becomes your anchor. It gives you a rational, recent, local basis for the offer price. And especially for buyers, researching comparable home sales is one of the cleanest ways to negotiate from strength instead of emotion. Because buyers need limits before they need strategy. They need to know the maximum price they're willing to pay. They need to identify the features that are non-negotiable. They need to decide what matters most: location, school district, condition, seller credits, timeline, rate buy down, whatever it is. Same for sellers. Sellers need a minimum acceptable price. They need to know which terms are firm. They need to know whether they care most about top dollar, speed, convenience, rent back, fewer contingencies, or certainty. Clear goals keep people focused. Without them, every counteroffer feels like a crisis. So far, that's the first big lesson. Preparation is negotiation power. Not charm, not bluffing, not seeing what happens. Preparation. And part of that preparation is understanding the kind of market you're standing in, because strategy should shift with conditions. In a buyer's market, buyers usually have more leverage. That's when you can ask for more. Maybe it's a price reduction. Maybe it's repair concessions. Maybe it's help with closing costs. Maybe it's credits that lower out-of-pocket expense at the exact moment buyers need breathing room. And if a home has been sitting for more than 5 weeks, or it's had price cuts, that often tells you something important. There may be more negotiating room there than the listing itself wants to admit. Now compare that with a seller's market. In a seller's market, sellers hold the advantage. They can often push for quicker closings, cleaner terms, fewer contingencies, stronger earnest money, and less back and forth overall. That doesn't mean buyers are powerless. It means buyers have to be more precise. That's where things like a mortgage pre-approval matter, not because it's glamorous, because it signals seriousness. A strong pre-approval tells the seller this buyer is qualified, ready, and less likely to fall apart in underwriting. In a competitive situation, that can matter almost as much as price, and sometimes more, because sellers are not only comparing numbers, they're comparing risk. That's why a strong initial offer matters so much. It doesn't just put a number on paper, it tells a story. It says, we know the market, we understand the home, we've done our homework, and we're not throwing darts. In multiple offer situations, that can also be where an escalation clause has a role. Used well, it helps a buyer stay competitive without blindly overshooting from the start. It gives structure to competition. Not always the right move, but in the right scenario, it can keep a buyer in the game without losing discipline. And that word matters too, discipline. Because the biggest mistakes I see from buyers usually come from one emotion: fear. Fear of losing the house. Fear of missing out. Fear that if they don't jump now, another chance won't come. And fear makes people negotiate badly. They offer beyond their limit. They waive protections they shouldn't waive. They stop asking good questions. They confuse urgency with wisdom. That's why knowing your limits and objectives before the negotiation starts is so important. It's what keeps the buyer from chasing the deal past the point where it still makes sense. But here's where negotiation gets more human. The market matters, the numbers matter, the terms matter. Still, some of the most important leverage in a negotiation comes from something softer: motivation. Why is the seller selling? That question changes everything. Are they relocating for a job and need certainty? Are they already under contract on another home? Are they trying to close quickly? Are they overwhelmed by repairs? Did the house just sit longer than they expected, and now they're getting nervous? Do they care more about convenience than squeezing every last dollar out of the deal? Understanding the other party's motivation can give you leverage no spreadsheet can. Because once you know what matters to them, you can tailor the offer. If the seller needs speed, maybe your value isn't the very highest price. Maybe it's the quick close. If they need cash flexibility, maybe they'd rather negotiate structure than headline number. If they're anxious about doing repairs, maybe repair credits make more sense than asking them to manage contractors before closing. This is where empathy becomes practical. People hear the word empathy and think softness, but in negotiation, empathy is information. It helps you understand what pressure the other side is under. It helps you speak to the real concern, not just the stated position. It helps you build rapport. And rapport matters, not because everyone needs to become best friends, because trust keeps deals moving. A negotiation with trust feels productive. A negotiation without trust feels suspicious. That's why effective communication is such a big part of real estate negotiation. The tone, timing, and language you use can either cool things down or light the match. I've seen agents send technically correct messages that still damage the deal because the delivery was off. Too sharp, too casual, too delayed, too vague. The numbers were not the problem, the communication was. Strong negotiators know how to control their reactions and redirect pressure productively. They keep a cool head. They stay professional. They don't get baited into emotional decision-making, because once that happens, judgment gets cloudy fast. And when things get tense, I think phone calls are wildly underrated. A lot of deal points are better negotiated live than over email or text. Why? Because tone comes through, urgency comes through, nuance comes through. You can hear hesitation, you can hear openness, you can hear when the other side is signaling that there's a path forward, even if the written response sounded hard. A live conversation also reduces miscommunication. It lets both sides clarify what they actually mean, which is often very different from what a short written counter seems to say. Sometimes a well-timed counteroffer over the phone gets farther than a blunt price reduction ever would. Because negotiation is not just what you ask for, it's when you ask, how you ask, and whether the other side feels backed into a corner or invited into a solution. Now, let's talk about the part of the transaction where, in my experience, more deals wobble than anywhere else: the inspection. This is where emotions can spike on both sides. The buyer starts imagining hidden costs. The seller starts feeling judged. Everybody suddenly has a PDF full of problems. And this is where discipline matters again. The inspection report is not a shopping spree. It is a negotiation tool. Used well, inspection results can absolutely help negotiate repairs or credits for necessary fixes. But the smart play is usually to focus on major issues: safety concerns, structural issues, big-ticket systems, things that materially affect value or livability, not the cosmetic stuff. Because once buyers start nitpicking minor issues, they lose credibility. And once credibility drops, leverage usually drops with it. What I've found is that the home inspection report works best when it helps prioritize. What actually matters here? What presents a safety issue? What's structural? What's expensive enough that it changes the economics of the purchase? That's where the negotiation should live. And increasingly, one of the strongest asks isn't always, "Please fix this." Sometimes it's, "Please credit us for this." Requesting repair credits instead of repairs gives buyers more control. They get to choose their own contractors, set their own standards, and make sure the work is done the way they want after closing. For many buyers, that's cleaner than trusting a rushed pre-closing repair. For sellers, it can be cleaner too. One credit, one agreement, less chaos. Again, that's negotiation through structure, not emotion. And sometimes that's the whole game: finding the form of concession that helps both sides keep moving. Because negotiation often involves concessions. Good deals usually do. The key is using concessions strategically. Maybe the seller covers some closing costs so the buyer preserves cash. Maybe the buyer gives ground on timeline in exchange for credits. Maybe the seller won't move much on price, but they will move on repairs, appliances, or possession terms. Concessions, used wisely, don't weaken your position. They can actually protect it. They create motion. They signal flexibility without surrender. So far, we've learned this: know the market, know the comps, know your client's limits, know the other side's motivation. And when the deal gets emotional, get clearer, not louder. That last part matters more than people think, because emotional control is one of the most underrated negotiation skills in this business. Staying calm and professional is not some nice extra. It is essential. When buyers panic, they overbid. When sellers get offended, they dig in. When agents react instead of respond, they make small issues bigger. Strong negotiators protect deals by protecting their own composure first. They don't mirror panic. They don't escalate drama. They don't let pressure force bad decisions. They slow the moment down. They reframe. They bring people back to facts, options, timelines, and outcomes. That's leadership in a transaction. And that's one reason real estate agents are so valuable during negotiations. A good agent sees angles the client can't see because the client is in it emotionally. The agent can read the temperature, interpret the subtext, advise on timing, and keep the process from spinning out over one rough response. That outside perspective is often what saves a deal. And still, with all of that said, there is one final negotiation skill that might matter more than all the others: knowing when to walk away. This is hard, especially after a buyer has pictured their furniture in the living room, or a seller has already spent weeks imagining the net proceeds. But the willingness to walk away is powerful. It keeps buyers from paying beyond their limit. It keeps sellers from accepting terms that create more pain than profit. It keeps everybody grounded in reality. And the strange thing is, being willing to walk away often makes you a better negotiator even when the deal still comes together. Because desperation has a smell. The other side can feel it. But when you know your ceiling, your floor, your objectives, and your non-negotiables, you negotiate differently, more clearly, more calmly, more honestly. You stop trying to force a bad fit into a good story. From my experience, some of the best deals I've ever seen were the ones where the client was fully prepared to lose the house rather than buy it on the wrong terms. That mindset changes the whole posture. It says, we want this deal, but we do not need this deal at any cost. That is real leverage. So what does all of this amount to? It amounts to this. Successful negotiation starts long before the first counteroffer. It starts with preparation, with market knowledge, with comparable sales, with a clear CMA, with clear limits, with understanding whether you're in a buyer's market or a seller's market, with reading whether the home has been sitting long enough to create room, with knowing whether a pre-approval, a strong opening number, or an escalation clause gives your buyer an edge, with understanding whether the seller wants speed, certainty, convenience, or simply relief. Then, once the negotiation begins, it becomes a communication game. Can you keep the tone productive? Can you build rapport? Can you gather information without giving away too much? Can you use phone calls when they'll move things forward faster than another cold email? Can you make concessions strategically? Can you use the inspection to focus on meaningful repairs or credits instead of blowing the deal up over cosmetics? Can you stay calm enough to make smart decisions when the pressure starts climbing? Because this matters for one reason above all. The best negotiators are not trying to win every point. They are trying to create the best possible outcome without losing sight of the whole deal. That's different. And it's what separates experienced, trusted professionals from people who are just reacting in real time. So here's the takeaway I'd leave you with today. Before your next negotiation, don't just ask, what should we offer? Ask 5 better questions. What does the market say? What do the comps support? What does my client actually need? What does the other side likely care about most? And where is the walk-away line? If you can answer those before the pressure starts, you're already ahead. And if you can stay calm enough to keep answering them once the pressure arrives, that's when deals start working in your favor. Because in this business, the strongest move is not always the toughest one. A lot of times, it's the clearest one. And clarity, in price, in terms, in timing, in tone, in priorities, that's what makes great negotiation feel almost effortless from the outside, even when, behind the scenes, it never is. Review your last deal. Not just the result, the negotiation itself. Where did momentum improve? Where did it wobble? What came from preparation and what came from pressure? What would you do differently next time? That kind of reflection is where better negotiating habits are built, and that's where better deals begin.